Only those with scars that can possibly understand the scars of others. I said to him, Naweed, we come from completely different worldviews, but the beauty and the power of the gospel, the good news, is that at the center of it isn't an unscathed God, but a scarred one.
Now, someone might say, well, God exists and has reasons for allowing, evil in the world, but why do I have to trust a God who allows suffering? How would you say then to a person who keeps refusing, to trust God because he sees so much evil and suffering in the world?
So I think that this is like the next natural question. So once you do the philosophical work, um, trust, I think, is my sort of knee jerk sort of reaction to, okay, well, sure, he can coexist with evil, but why, like, why on earth should I trust him if he does that sort of thing? And so this is a deep question on multiple levels, metaphysically, existentially, personally. Um, and I find that personally, this becomes less intellectual and more about a question of about the heart. And so let me tell you a story. Okay, so I'm in Toronto, hence the hat, Toronto Raptors basketball, NBA. Let's go. And so I'm in Toronto. I worked there for a couple of years with RZAM. And during that time in our office, we hosted this exhibit entitled Beautiful by this American artist named Craig Hawkins. And he had partnered with this Indian humanitarian organization called Agni Raksha. And their partnership was created to raise funds and bring awareness to the horrific practice of bride burning. I don't know how familiar you are with this practice, but in southern Asia, thousands of women every single year, in either some domestic violence, some act of domestic violence, or because of some sort of marriage arrangement, they are burned alive. So the husband either is being violent towards them, or in the marriage situation, they can't afford the dowry, the payment from the bride's family to the groom's family. And so the consequence in some of these families, not all of them, but some of them, is to burn the bride to be. Okay. So some of them just like throw acid on them and it disfigures them. Others will take kerosene, pour it on them, and literally just light them on fire. It's just so heartbreaking. And what makes matters even worse there is that the legal system in some of those countries, so far too often, their perpetrators never face justice. Some of them just pay off the police, and while others just run from the police. And many of the women are too frightened or too poor to really pursue justice. So, how can you trust a God that allows that sort of stuff to happen? And so, one day I'm in Toronto, we have this exhibit, it's all these paintings on the walls, And this one gentleman comes in, and his name is Naweed. And Naweed, he was a non-Christian guy, comes in, he wants to check out the artwork. Cool. I'm going to walk him around. I'm going to show him the artwork. And after I show him around, we end the tour with my favorite piece, Andreas. It was this photograph. And it's a photograph of a group of these women from the humanitarian organization. They're all burn victims, and they are smiling and together in this photograph. And Naweed, the gentleman, Naweed, he asked me one of the most profound questions that I've ever heard. It's always stuck with me. He says this: do these women live together? And I was like, oh man, no one's ever asked that. I'm not too sure, but how come? Like, why are you asking? And he says this, I'll never forget this, Andreas. He says this: I suspect that they do, because it is only those with scars that could possibly understand the scars of others. Only those with scars that can possibly understand the scars of others. I said to him, Naweed, we come from completely different worldviews, but the beauty and the power of the gospel, the good news, is that at the center of it isn't an unscathed God, but a scarred one. And as I walked away from the exhibit with Naweed, I said, "Man, you have a great name. What does that name mean?" And he says, "Oh, Naweed is Arabic, and it means good news." And I just thought that was so interesting. So, listen, even though we might not know every sort of reason for every situation of suffering and evil and injustice, the person of Jesus means that the answer can't be because God doesn't care. He cares deeply, and he cares deeply about your hurt and mine. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. So if he didn't care, then he wouldn't have come. And he would not have come and become the scarred God. So the Bible's ultimate response and unique response to how can we trust this God that allows evil and suffering in our world is Emmanuel, God with us. And this is that's a huge point when it comes to the doctrine of incarnation, God enfleshed amongst us in our hurt. And sorry, I'm just going to end with this because I don't want to monologue too long, Andres, but it's a really, really important question. You got to notice two things, I think, when you're reading the Gospels. One, that Jesus, who's God in the flesh, that's the point of the doctrine of incarnation. When we read the Gospels, we get to see how God responds to evil and suffering and injustice when he's that close in proximity in the flesh. So there's a mom who loses her son. There is a pair of sisters who lose their brother. There are those who've been rejected by society and religion, those possessed by evil, the sick, the violent, and the poor, all of these sorts of things. And we get to ask the question, well, how does God respond to those things? And the answer is, he hates it. He assaults things like evil and suffering. And he doesn't run away from it, but runs to it. And he runs to it, like all of those examples that I just enumerated, he runs to it not with anger and vengeance or something like that, but runs through it with compassion and healing and taking individuals in those circumstances and redirecting them towards the good and towards the just. And he encounters so many of those situations with tears. And so that's point one. And point number two, it's not enough that Jesus just observes suffering in the gospel. That would get me to trust him, but not go all the way. No, when we read the Gospels, we see how Jesus himself suffers. And this really garners my trust. We see what it is like. We see that God knows what it's like personally to be a refugee, to be impoverished, to be hungry, to be thirsty, to experience rejection from society and from the religious authorities, to encounter personal evil, to experience psychological and physiological trauma. And think about this, because I would even include sexual trauma here, because they force him to take off his clothes and he is hung naked in front of his creation. He experiences abandonment, an unjust trial, he's tortured and ultimately executed. So I think that when I think about the question of trust, it's the person of Jesus that gets me to trust God, even though God has chosen to allow suffering and evil in this world.